The topic for this space was inspired by, once again, inspired by a video shared by Connor Boyack, I think his surname is. But it's done, I saw the video, I'm sure, maybe even last year, but it's done the rounds once before. But it was a state representative talking about how we need to start looking at kids or doing away with the notion that children belong to their parents, and sort of implementing this idea that the children are everyone's. And that came to the forefront of my mind. In fact, my family had recently watched the new Lilo and Stitch live action version, and they changed some things up in the ending. I never saw it myself, but they changed the ending. In the animated version, Lilo's sister essentially takes custody of her because what is the phrase from the film, Ohana means family, and all the families stay together, and they make it work. She's still a young girl and she's her sister, and she wasn't expecting to have custody of her, of a younger sister, but they make it work because family is that important. In the new adaptation, Lilo becomes a ward of the state so that her sister can go off to study at university in the United States of America, leave Hawaii to mainland USA. And it just felt really prudent right now, that now more than ever, perhaps, that we need to address this scenario, this situation, this programming that's they're trying to install into people, particularly parents. Whose children are they? Are they ours? Because really, as the years go on, it's feeling less and less like they are. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Paul?
I've got a lot to add, Alec, and good morning to you. I agree. There's an erosion, I think, of what I would call some basic natural rights. It's not just one of these videos. I'm not sure if we could share the video link around, perhaps, but it's not just one of these values that skirts around the edges of the Overton window, perhaps, or a fringe opinion. I think it's very much a concept, what you've just described there, that chips away at one of the fundamental pillars of the West. So I believe that parents have a natural right to raise their children as they see fit. And I thought that was somewhat self-evident, being raised in the West myself, but here we are. We seem to be in a position where we need to defend the idea of raising our children free from undue influence by the state or community. And I don't think you have to look far to support the idea that that's a foundational Western value. You look at the framed by the US Constitution itself, and even back to John Locke, one of the most influential Enlightenment thinkers. So this concept of natural rights as being an umbrella term for raising your own children, that includes the right to autonomy and ownership of the resulting responsibility. And I think children, as extensions of their parents' lives and efforts, fall within this domain of personal responsibility, don't they? I mean, we can even see this in pet ownership. Say, do we claim collective responsibility and ownership of dogs? Does a neighborhood take turns walking the dogs living in the street? Not where I live. Dog owners care for and feed and exercise their animals, and that's reciprocated with the love of the animal, and others are considered outsiders who don't have skin in the game. So, I find it almost comical that the very fruits of the West, even down to the video technology used to record that piece that we're discussing here, is being used to chip away at what I think is a fundamental Western premise around natural rights. So some opening thoughts there.
Yeah, I wanted to quickly touch on something, just or extrapolate on a point you just made, Paul, before John jumps in. But it's funny how you use the comparison with dogs. There's no collective ownership of dogs. Why is there this attempt at collective ownership over our children? And fundamentally, it comes down to the fact that the state sees our children as an asset. They are an asset of the state. Dogs are not useful to the state. Children are. And so the emphasis is on that which is useful to them, not that which is not. And I think looking at it through that lens really sort of opens up that perspective. John, it's great to have you in. Do you want to add it? We're only doing opening remarks, so feel free to jump in on that.
Hey, yeah, I apologize for being late. It's the beauty of having a global space, right? I'm in the middle of my workday, and so sometimes my meetings run long, and I'm not able to always keep the exact time. So, but yeah, this is one of the things that absolutely drives me batty. This idea that children belong to the collective. I hate that sentiment, because as much as I like my neighbors and they are very aligned on values, I don't want them making parental decisions for me. Even though we're the same religion and we're the same, come from the same or similar backgrounds and things like that. My kids are my kids, and I want to be able to raise them in the way that I want to raise them, because there are some philosophical differences between me and my neighbors. And so being able to do that is such a fundamental right of being a parent. I was actually just listening to a podcast that goes into G.K. Chesterton and talking about this idea of, I think it was like Ayn Rand, who's a big like libertarian like thinker, right? Talking about like how, nobody has an obligation to one another. But when it's the parent, when it's a kid telling a parent, I have no obligation to listen to you, the world seems to be okay with that. But if it's a parent telling a kid, I have no obligation to you, at that point we say it's wrong. But instead, what we need to be saying is like, no, you both have an obligation to each other, which we call a family, right? It's what we call a relationship or a relation or a member of our family. And so like that is the most efficient way to raise up the next generation, but it's also like the best way and the most liberty-minded way of doing it. It doesn't require huge amounts of tax money to have a bureaucrat in every home, right? It doesn't require these crazy laws to be able to have good parents in our home. But the more and more the state tries to take over the role of parent, the more and more we are going to see a degradation in kids doing well.
Yeah, I 100% agree, John. I think you made an excellent point there with sort of the obligations to parents and kids to parents. And I think the messaging is very much pushed that kids have zero obligation to their parents, and that it's ultimately their lives, and who the only person, or the person that matters the most is themselves, and everyone else is a very distant, very distant second. And I think that sort of messaging lends itself to, as you just described, the segregation of the family unit, the split of the family unit. Why is that messaging pushed? Because it's not pushed vice versa. There's no messaging that parents have no obligation to their kids, but there's a messaging around, very heavy messaging around kids not having any obligation to their parents or wider family. And what that means is, you're encouraging that split. Then you're encouraging the child to segregate themselves from the family. You don't even have to do a lot of work, because the sort of the messaging is being inbuilt from a very young age, and so it lends itself to an individual who is already ripe for plucking, then for becoming an asset of the state as opposed to an asset of the family. And I think that's what we see. I think maybe that's what we're talking about here is this concept of children becoming more and more state assets and less family assets. And I think it's a very dangerous two-way street here, where we have some bureaucrats within the public school system. Obviously not everyone, but the public school system, for me at least, or from my opinion, is a vehicle by which these bureaucrats can begin to segregate the family very effectively, right? That are trying to undermine this family unit. And then you also have parents who are, whether consciously or unconsciously, are sort of subverting whole chunks of their responsibility onto anyone who's willing to pick it up. And we've fallen into this dangerous mindset where many parents believe it's the responsibility of the state to educate our children. It's an obligation of the state to educate our children. And that's a really dangerous mindset, whether it's has malicious intent, or whether it just has, or it's purely negligent. It's a very dangerous mentality to have. And I've got a couple notes, as always. I'd like to talk on the first one, because I don't know what the deal is in the US, and even Australia. So, John, Paul, I'd like to hear what your knowledge is around the public school system here. But we've recently, some things have been doing the rounds, and I've shared it to my Twitter page, and I'm going to share the post to Spaces. But there's two posts. The first is something I saw, my wife actually saw on Facebook, and she sent it to me immediately and said, you need to make sure this A goes on X, and B, you bring it up in your Spaces. But it's a poster from a city council here in the UK, in England specifically, in a city called Nottingham, and it's a whole poster about what fines parents will receive if they take their children out of school, right? What the government will fine parents for not getting permission to take their children out of school, right? And I don't know if that exists in the US and Australia, but obviously that is an absurd concept that's been 100% normalized here in the UK. And yet there's a lot of grumbling from parents, right? Because to go on vacation during school time is significantly cheaper than it is to do it during the school, the vacation periods. And there's a lot of grumbling here in the UK about, oh, it's so unfair, but nobody does anything. They still go along with the system. The system can do as it pleases. Nobody makes an effort to instigate change. But that's the first post, right? And obviously a terrible concept. And it is considerable. And if you do it 3 times within 3 years, the poster says, your case will be taken to court. You will be taken to court for deciding when you want to take, for not seeking the school's permission to take your children out of school during school hours. It's almost, for me, it almost seems like a hostage situation at this point. Where actually, my wife likened it to almost like adoption. The state have adopted your children, and you are allowed visitation rights between these hours because they've told you you're only allowed visitation rights between these hours. You're like a deadbeat ex-dad or deadbeat divorcee dad who is only allowed. The court have decided you're only allowed visitation rights between these hours on these days, and if you go against that, you'll be taken back to court or you'll be fined. And the second post I'm going to share, and then I want you guys to jump in, is there was a story apparently that the headline is "Ending Fines for Taking Kids on Term Time Holidays to be Debated by MPs." And I just think, and the reaction to this was like, "Oh, too right, it's about time." And what's going to happen then? The parents are going to be, "Oh, I'm so grateful for you, Mr. Government, for allowing me my rights back over my children." And they're going to create this whole environment wherein the parents are super grateful for the rights they've been given back that were taken away. And obviously I could talk, the whole spaces could be on these two posts alone, but I'm gonna shut myself up, and I'm gonna invite John and Paul for you guys to have a chat.
Yeah, I'll jump in. This is I'll address the first one. So the fines for taking your child on vacation during the school year. I don't know that necessarily exists in the US. But with that said, if your child is absent, and it depends on the state, for so many days in a year, you can actually be referred to the Department of Child Services and possibly lose your children if you're not upholding like their attendance at the public school. Like that is the thing that can happen. And so that's something that I think we need to address. In the US, the laws are called compulsory education laws. A lot of states have not necessarily gotten rid of them, but they've poked a lot of holes in that law. So it's easy to get out of having to comply with that law. So for example, here in Utah, where I'm located, a parent can excuse any absence they would like to. So including if they decide to take a vacation in the middle of the school year, they can do that, and they can excuse the absence. And the state cannot come after you for attendance issues because you've excused the absence. It's the unexcused absences where they'll come and try and like charge a kid with truancy or charge the parents with a compulsory education violation. So that's Utah, but I know it's different in each state. So that's the wild part. Remind me what the second one was. Oh, giving back the rights. I was laughing so hard because it's true. Like the state, if the state can grant rights, then it means they can take rights away. And if that's the case, then it's not a right. That at the end of the day, that's what it is. If the state is the one who can give you permission to do things with your children, then you don't have the right to parent your children, except if the government allows you to. And I reject that. Are there parents out there who are terrible and need to probably lose their kids? Yeah. But those are extreme cases, and we shouldn't make those extreme cases the norm. We shouldn't treat every parent as if that's what they're doing. And they're not. It's, percentage wise, it's a very small percentage. Even when I was working in rougher schools, the percentage of kids who I felt were maybe in abusive relationships was still like less than 1% of the school kids. They might have been parented differently than I would have done it, but to think that they were necessarily in a abusive home was not my understanding of what they were doing. So, Paul, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you, John. In the modern world, I often think to myself, there's not much that can shock me anymore, but this conversation has. I'm quite shocked at what you described there, Alec, about the state permission, the concept of state permission for taking kids out of school. And I can't believe I'm going to say this in the former penal colony that is Australia, formal in air quotes sometimes, but it sounds like we may be a little more free in this regard than what you've both described. There's certainly, and obviously I don't have firsthand experience with kids in the state school system. There's certainly the vibe of, I'm happy to delegate kids to the state and send them off to school. And I do hear this idea of, oh, it's school holidays. What do I do with my kids now? As if they're a burden. But I'm unaware of any fines for taking kids out of school. I'm by no means an expert here, but anecdotally, I do hear of parents taking their kids out of school, particularly for extended periods of time, to travel or to fit into other kind of life moves. So it certainly seems possible without the type of friction that you're describing there. But one thing you said, Alec, there really resonated with me. It does seem like a hostage situation, or again, going back to how you opened, an issue of asset ownership. Now, it reminded me a little bit of the Charlie Munger quote, show me the incentives and I'll show you the behavior. Why are our children the object of this concept of ownership when dogs and other things that aren't of practical utility aren't? Well, they're the greatest potential possibly for future state advocates, aren't they? And John, you said something earlier as well, just to rewind a little bit, my kids are my kids. And I thought that was such a fundamental statement that you could possibly even justify from a genetic level. So, children are genetically half of each parent. They're created from the unique combination of their DNA. And it's just a biological reality that establishes a bond between parents and children. And that's inherently individual and can't be replicated by any collective entity. And because children are made from their parents' genetic material, parents have a unique and, I would say, non-transferable responsibility to nurture and guide them throughout life. It's not just social or contractual, but it's rooted in the act of procreation itself, isn't it? Now, having children imposes a moral and practical obligation to care for the child because the parents are the ones who brought this life into existence. And, for parents who share half of their child's genetic material, I would think are best positioned to understand and respond to their individual needs as opposed to a collective environment, even assuming that is kind of possible. These collectivist ideas that I think seek to redistribute that fundamental responsibility, ignore that genetic and biological basis of parenthood, and they dilute this responsibility that I think is a perfect example of that classic tragedy of the commons scenario where no one feels fully responsible and the quality of care suffers as a result, and into that vacuum steps the power of the state, or am I off there?
I think you're spot on. I was looking up. I mean, you mentioned this hostage situation. Horace Mann, who is considered the father of the American education system, public education system, has a quote talking about this, which I think is perfect for what we're talking about today. He says, "We who are engaged in the sacred cause of education are entitled to look upon all parents as having given hostages to our cause." That's the father of the public education system in America saying that. Like, I don't agree with that. Is education good? Absolutely it is. But I'm not giving my child up as a hostage to the education system. I'm still the parent.
It almost feels like we could end the space on that quote alone, John. Yeah, it feels like that pretty much explains everything we're talking about, and the extrapolates on the title of the space is exceptionally well. And it's so I want to explore those collective points a bit more, and it's something I talk about a lot. And for me, it's one of the passionate elements of my family's homeschooling journey. But you see, for me, education is, there's an academic side to education. Obviously, there's an academic element, but it's considerably more than that. And it's, there's social related education, there's experiential, there's life, there's just the education you get from living and doing things. And for me, education is legacy. That's what it is for me, right? Many of us can't pass down a great deal of wealth financially. And even those that can, there's always the risk that the wealth will fumble, will decline, will be lost accidentally or negligently. But the lessons we pass down, the teachings we pass down, those, if we do that right, those last generations and generations and generations. And there's a statistic that always floats around, and it's something like your children will spend 16,000 hours in school. Right, 16,000 hours of their childhood they will spend in school. And for me, that's 16,000 hours under the influence of the state when you take into the public school system. And we're trying to say that, education, because we'll use education all the time. Education, it's the public education system. It's not, it's a bastardization of the term education, because it's purely focusing on what they'd like to call academic education, the academic element of education. I'll disagree with their interpretation of it, but still, I don't think they're very effective at doing it in most cases. But that is the element they're talking about. But by using this terminology of education, they're sort of co-opting that whole holistic approach. And I have to stop and ask myself sometimes, is it my legacy? I mean, obviously I homeschool, but when I reflect on that, it's sort of, is it my legacy or is it the state's legacy? If my children are spending 16,000 hours with them under the influence of the state, and many dads are working very long hours, right? Are they spending more time with the state than they are with dad? Right? What does that actually mean? Because if they're spending more time with the state than they are with dad, whose influence is being passed on at a greater capacity? I mean, ultimately, it's a case of numbers. How many hours do dads spend with their children, especially if they're working late or they have to work weekends? I'm very fortunate to work from home, but obviously my wife is here to predominantly educate our kids from the homeschooling perspective, but she's a champion of our family values, right? So she's an extension of myself, and I'm an extension of her when it comes to those sorts of scenarios. But it's really, 16,000 hours is a huge amount. And within that, you sort of have the state is able to pass down their own legacy. Because I don't believe, again, going back to this, education is holistic. I don't believe you can pass down knowledge without passing down values and virtues. It's present in everything you do, the way you teach, the way you speak, the environment in which you teach, how you handle disruption. So even if you're passing down, like some people like to call hardcore facts, like math, or this, men, controversial here, but men have XY chromosomes and women have XX chromosomes, right? Even if you want to say, I'm just teaching them these straight facts, you're still communicating values and virtues, right? At all times, you cannot separate them. And so what happens is your children are spending 16,000 hours in an environment in which the state is passing down their values and virtues. How much time are they spending as a whole family unit? Because even when they come home, even if mom is the stay-at-home mom, there's meals to prep, there's cleaning to be done, there's chores to be done, there's bedtimes to be doing, there's homework to be done. How much actual, family time do people get every day? I guarantee you it's less than the 6 or 7 hours they spend in school. I'm going to open it up to you guys again, just to expand on those points if you have anything to add.
Yeah, legacy is a great lens to view this through as well. That education as legacy leads into legacy as individual. So as you said, whose influence is being passed on? And I think there is an argument again there through that lens for individualism. So individualism allows for, here's another word that's been co-opted, a diversity of cultural and moral values to be passed down through families. And that enriches society in the classical sense. So collectivism, by contrast, as imposed by the state, risks imposing a homogenized set of values that you may not agree with. It may not align with your family's beliefs. And perhaps it's helpful to view parenting as like an art form. It requires a tailored vision and consistent application. And that's best achieved, I think, by the individual parents rather than the collective body that may have conflicting priorities. And you can maybe think of an artist creating a masterpiece, and it's the artist's vision and skill and personal investment results in a unique work of art that is the adult manifestation of your young children. And if you imagine that piece of art being created by committee, well, with each member offering different ideas and no single person in charge, and it's just going to be a chaotic piece lacking in any coherence, won't it? So yeah, I completely agree with that legacy. And I think the legacy needs to be that of the parents who have the most skin in the game and the most investment. And I also agree with what you said there about it's not just what you teach, but how. And, you mentioned those straight hard facts there, like maths. It's what I try to introduce there from quite an early age is, here's a fact that I think will be useful, or something I'm trying to teach you. And here's the accompanying reason why I think it will be useful, so that they can internalize the lesson, as opposed to just sit down, be quiet, internalize this thing. And the great go-to example is, basic maths. And with my daughter, I get her involved in all cash transactions. When we buy something in a store, I get her to pick the note, so she knows the numbers on the notes and can kind of start to learn why it's useful to know these numbers, so you can actually purchase this thing you want. So there's a correlation between this utility and this piece of information, or these hard facts I'm trying to teach you, and this is the benefit you get out of it. And I had another good example. My 4-year-old daughter was with me when I was changing the brake pads in our car recently, and she was quite fascinated, and that was an opportunity to teach her about friction. It's good that the car stops when you need it to, so you don't crash, right? And these are the components that do it, and this is how it works, and friction and drag, and this is where you see it in other parts of your life, so you can avoid injury. And that leads on to how the hydraulic system works, and pressure and things. It's a relatable experience to her. And I was amazed at how a 4-year-old could grasp these concepts when you frame it in a way that's of use to them. And I see no evidence of that in the public school system. There's just the internalize this because I said so, which really is the ultimate nature of the state.
No, that's a great point, Paul. And I'm sitting here thinking about the conversation is, Alec, you're right. Like, we cannot separate values from education. No matter how you're teaching whatever subject it is, there's a value behind that. Even if it's excitement for a subject, like, it's a value towards that. Like, I loved math, and I taught with a teacher who was okay, and my kids walked out of math class more excited about math because they saw my excitement for it as when I was teaching, and those even something simple as a value like that. And one of the things about, again, because our societies are set up to where public education becomes often a co-parent with anybody who sends their child there, is the elections about who is running the school become so heated and valuable, and or at least value laden with in those systems. Even in a very conservative state like Utah, where I live, certain parts of that are more left leaning. But if you're not, and you're sending your kids there, you care about what curriculum they're using because you want it to align with your values. And I think it's one of the major, I don't know how to say it, like, major flaws with the public education system is that it's always been a political debate scene. In fact, I was talking with the deputy superintendent of schools in Utah today, and said, like, public schools have always been a political debate. When they were very first formed and compulsory education became a thing in the United States, it was the Protestants didn't want the Catholics to be running schools and teaching Catholic values. They wanted every kid to learn Protestant values. And then you get to, people are having a debate over whether evolution should be taught or not. And then should we have prayer in school or not? And now it's like, what library books should we have in school? These are all political debates, and it will always be that way because we're dealing with people's kids, which will always bring out the mama bear and papa bear out of every parent because they want their values taught to their kids. And so that's part of why I support, like, parents being able to make these choices for their children of where they're going to school. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
I think there's excellent points were made, and I think there's a cohesive theme there between yours, John, and Paul's comments, and it ties into one of my notes, and that's sort of those conflicting views, right, between parents and the state. We can see it there, where sort of public education system, certainly in the States, becomes a political hotbed, and Paul, you described it, in terms of built on that in terms of the legacy, and to me, when I think of this, because many a pushback I get is parents saying, well, I equip my child to disagree with something the school says. My kid knows what we believe as a family, and therefore they know when they're in a school setting what's right, what's wrong, what we believe, what the school might believe, and how that might be different. And I can empathize with those points, and I can understand that reasoning. But here's where I think that reasoning sort of falls flat, and it's sort of the point you guys brought up there. When you have these conflicting views between parents and state, and parents and the school system, right? Whether that's curriculum, methodologies, anything, and anything in between. When you have these conflicting views, what you're saying to your child is, we disagree with, our family disagrees with the fundamental values of the school. We disagree with them, but I'm going to send you there, and they're going to be your caregiver for the 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, because I trust them enough to make sure you're okay. I trust them enough to look after you. I trust them enough to make sure they uphold your mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being, because that's their responsibility for 7 hours a day. So and then you create this sort of distrust in your kid, and they internalize these conflicting views. Wait, so I can't trust the government, and my family values are different to their values, but you trust them enough to have my best, to make sure they have my best interests in mind for 6 or 7 hours a day, 5 days a week. How does that work? How does, what lesson are we actually then teaching our children? Because what ends up happening is you might be presenting these conflicting views to them, but the school presents a very static view. A very static view. The school's view is unanimous and unchanging and unflinching in the face of any opposition. So when they get into the school setting, they're then faced by these two entities, you and your family, and the school system. You and your family are telling them all of these conflicting views. You're creating this level of uncertainty in them. There's a level of distrust, and it's almost akin to saying, you should be telling your kids to eat healthy or to avoid alcohol when you're a heavy drinker, or you're always binging junk food. It's like, well, if you're saying it, it should be true because you're my parent, but actually your actions go against what you say. So how can I trust you? If your actions are different to what you say, if your words don't align with your actions, your words can't be trusted. But the school is always solidified in its approach. It's unmoving, it's unflinching. And so they then get to school and think, well, these guys are fully committed to their beliefs and what they say. So maybe they are more trusting than my family is. John, you look like you want to add something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to kind of add on to what you were saying is, by sending your kids to a school, you're saying we value whatever that school is doing, whether you mean to or not. You are giving approval for what the school is doing by saying, here's my child, teach them. And so if you don't agree with what the school is doing, or, maybe it's a government entity, it doesn't necessarily have to just be the school, whatever it is, if you are sending your child somewhere, you're saying what this person is teaching you is valuable because I'm sending you there for 5, 6, 7 hours a day. So I don't think all parents look at that. And in my realm, I have parents who actually, when my wife and I pulled our kids to start homeschooling, said that we were giving up the fight on what's happening in the public schools. And my response to them is, my kids are not the front line of this fight, on what the values are in the public schools. That I can be the front line because I'm a grown man. I can do that. My wife's a grown woman. We can be the front line. We have the experience to stand there and be like, no, these are my values and not be moved. But to send my 9-year-old son and say, hey, I need you to go figure out this highly complex political movement that we don't agree with in the public school system. You got to figure out a way to navigate that. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's a good move. And so, no, when we pulled our kids to homeschool, we were not giving up on the fight. What we were doing is we were solving it for our family. And really, that's the only way that you can do this, is to solve it on an individual family basis.
I fully agree, John. And what you've said there, my sentiment is I'm not sending my kids to be casualties in a war they can't win or they're not equipped to fight, right? Because I've referenced this tweet before, but Jonathan Prescott, Homeschool Life LLC, great account to follow. He said it before. You can't fight the beast and win. You have to starve the beast, right? And they're talking about the public education system. If you keep sending your kids there, it will continue to exist as it does. If all parents were to suddenly say, well, I'm taking my kids out because we all disagree with this, that school would change quickly. The values of the school would change quite dramatically, quite rapidly. I'm going to stop it there and give Paul a chance to speak on the topic we were just discussing.
Yeah, I'm going to feed the beast by sending you to an institution that we disagree with. What a message. And that was very much the topic of our last discussion, gentlemen, wasn't it, regarding begging school boards to behave differently without questioning why they're there why the children are there in the first place. And that word trust came up again. We heavily dived into that also in our last space. That quote you came up with there, that pushback, Alec, you mentioned people say to you, well, my kids know what we believe as a family, and therefore they're well equipped to go into this war. Maybe they know what you believe as a family. That's questionable, but let's grant that. But perhaps you haven't taught them why they need to side with that belief or defend the family's belief in the environment that you send them out to. They may understand it, but why fight for it? We disagree with the environment we're voluntarily placing you in. What message does that send? You've lost the fight for your child's trust for life if you seed that contradiction into your kids' minds. But here we are seeing this unfold time and time again.
Well, I think you made an excellent point there, Paul, in the sense that, I can't send my 9-year-old. It's not fair for me as a parent to send my 9-year-old in with the knowledge that, let's see the point that he fully understands and comprehends our family values, and he's more than willing to defend those and champion those in the public space. It's not fair of him to be in that position. It's not fair for him to be in a scenario in which he has to disagree with an entity as large and as powerful, for lack of a better word, as the state. He shouldn't be a champion of my family values against the state. He should not be in a position where he has to fight for those values. That's my responsibility as a father, and will become his responsibility as he grows older and becomes a man himself. But it's not fair for us to use them as fodder. It's very much the same. I'm sure you can relate, John, where many people, many Christians will say, well, I send my kids to school to further the message of Christ. And again, it's the exact same. It's the exact same principles there. They're not, in a school system which does not champion those values. That's not their fight to make. It really isn't, and it's irresponsible for us as parents, and downright neglectful for us as parents to be able to put that expectation on children. And you're absolutely right, Paul. We touched on this in one of our previous spaces, and it's once again, it's highly relevant here. But it's the overarching principle of parents defaulting to the school's authority. That's what I was talking about when I shared those two tweets to the spaces. The fines and the MPs discussing the removal of fines. It's parents are now, certainly now it's worse than ever, but they are now undergoing this transformation where they're gradually defaulting to the school's authority on everything. Right? Oh, I'm going to have to ask them for permission to take my children out of school so we can go on a family vacation. Oh, my child is unwell. I now have to phone up the school and justify what decision I've made in order to not send them in. And not only that, at least here in the UK, you have to ring them every day. You can't say, oh, my son has tonsillitis. He'll be back in 3 days, 4 days. No, you have to ring them every morning to tell them they're not going to be in, because they're keeping tabs on their assets. They want to know exactly what's going on with their assets. As far as they're concerned, they are their assets, not yours. And so they want to make sure they're keeping tabs on that. But it's with one of the big things is bullying in my experience. Defaulting to the authority of the state once again, or the school. We touched on this, where parents are going to complain to the school board because this boy's getting changed in the girls' locker room because they're now on the girls' sports team because they've decided they're a girl, or there's borderline pornographic content in school libraries now, or inappropriate sex education classes. Instead of these parents saying, well, I'm not going to send my kids there. Ultimately what we're saying is parents are okay with, their daughters being potentially sexually assaulted in the locker room by a boy, because that's their fear. That's the ultimate fear. Why don't we let boys in the girls' locker room? Because we're afraid the girls will be essentially sexually assaulted or sexually harassed. But by going to the school board and complaining and saying, what you're saying is, school, you need to do something about this. And for me, that's an objectively abhorrent sort of stance to take. No, I'm the parent. I'm going to do something about this. And it's not going to be complain to the school board and hope they do something. I'm going to be intervening directly right here, right now. The same with bullying. What's the default approach for parents? Oh, yes, your child comes home. I've been bullied. Right, we're going to go to the school and we're going to tell the school and we're going to see what the school's going to do about it. They're going to tell us the plan, right? And then we're going to hope that plan works. And then if it doesn't, we'll go back and tell them it didn't work. And worst case scenario, there's stories that come up too regularly on the news where children commit suicide because the parents have just been like, school, do something, do something, do something, do something, do something. And they just don't. Or what the school does is ineffective and it doesn't solve the problem. Rather, I can't ever fathom being in a scenario where my children are in danger and then you don't do everything in your power to take control of the situation and say, you're not going to this place that's causing you harm, that is putting you in danger. John, you look like you're ready to add something.
Yeah, I was just, as you were talking, I was thinking about a good friend of mine that I've met in recent years since I began homeschooling. She's a longtime homeschooler, been doing it for probably 20 plus years. And I still view myself as a newbie when it comes to homeschooling, and I've been doing it for 4 years now. But her very first year with her son, she took her child to school, enrolled him in kindergarten, had him there. Well, that happened to be the year that Hurricane Katrina came through the US and devastated New Orleans. And so her and her husband and her were going to take her son, and they were going to go down for a week and do service to help these people out. And the school basically said, you can't do that. You can't go serve these people who have been devastated by this major hurricane as a family because your child needs to be in school. And the question she asked herself was, I think, so appropriate to this conversation. She asked herself, well, who gave you the authority to do that? To tell me I can't do this with my child? And then she thought about it. It's like, oh, I did. We're going to homeschool now. And from that point on, she homeschooled her children because she realized it was this tug of war that she did not want to have with the public schools. She didn't want to have to ask permission to go and help people who have been devastated by some tragic event. She didn't want to have to ask, be like, hey, this is a great time for me to go visit Disneyland or Disney World or something like that. She didn't want to have to ask that, so she could schedule her child's learning around her family, as opposed to the family having to schedule around the school.
I love that story, John. What an amazing onboarding journey that was. And when you think about that, the service of people impacted by Hurricane Katrina there, or anyone in difficulty really, that's homeschooling right there. That's nurturing culture right there. You don't learn that in the classroom. You learn that by observing your parents, seeing and feeling the suffering of others, and putting themselves out to support them. That's the school of life. That's just beautiful. There are so many lessons that are downstream from just that 1 week or whatever it would have been that just can't be replicated in a classroom. And I love that penny drop moment. That's such a beautiful story, actually. And I think there's some utility in how we've been framing this discussion like a war. The term's come up a few times now, perhaps a cultural war or a war for authority and influence, or as you put it, John, a tug of war with the school. And it does feel like a little like conscription. We're conscripting our youth to go and fight in this war that they needn't. As parents, we are the current custodians of culture, just like the person you referenced there, John, who just decided, well, this is the appropriate behavior when my countrymen or my culture or is experiencing difficulties. This is how we act. This is how I manifest my obligation, me serving my obligation to my culture. And it's not fair for us to use our kids as fodder. You use that term, Alex, in that needless war. I was reminded hearing you both speak there of that phrase. I don't know who it's attributed to, but it goes something like, let me know war so my kids can know peace. That is our obligation. And through living those principles and demonstrating how to live, not just what the facts are you need to know, that's education. That's the bond. That's legacy. And I think it's not just an obligation for parents. I think it's one of the pathways to a life of value, something that we've spoken about this before as well, something you can look back upon from your deathbed and say, of all the things I've said and done, I am most proud of that legacy I've instilled in my children. And there's a reciprocity to that. I often find it useful to flip an argument and see how you feel about the situation when the roles are reversed. If we take this kind of, as to circle back to the title of the discussion here, if we look at a communal approach to the end of someone's life, those abdicating the beginning of life to the state, sending their kids off to this collective schooling or considering them to be assets of the state, I think will reap what they sow. That teaches children to do the same to them, to the adults, when they become dependent with age. How many bureaucrats visit communally owned elderly? How many are helping them with bodily functions at all hours, or tolerating repeated stories with the same level of interest and smiles as the first time they heard them, or reminiscing over shared experiences and taking pride in personal achievements? If you offer these things to your children in their youth, they're likely to be reciprocated when you become dependent. And I don't want to be in a bed and rely on some bureaucracy to treat me with care when I'm of no utility to society anymore, except for possibly the seeds that I sow early on. So I'd like people to maybe think about that. It's a little self-serving perhaps, but we tend to reap what we sow in this life, and there's an opportunity to do good now and possibly be rewarded in a very mutually beneficial way when our life comes to an end.
That's great, Paul. I think, I don't think that sentiment is inherently selfish at all. I think it's just an objective fact of parenting that kids absorb the lessons we live, right? The lessons we live, not the lessons we lecture them on. And so if we are living, I'd like to invite Craig up because, you've been on a couple times, Craig, and I always value your insights, certainly as a former public school teacher. So if there's anything you'd like to add to any of the points we covered today, feel free, shoot.
Okay, I'm multitasking, so I apologize in advance. But I was just curious. We had a Supreme Court case this morning, I think, that said the state of Tennessee had the right to usurp parents' rights, and I'm assuming their doctors' rights, to prescribe hormonal type therapy for a child who may be transitioning or going through some issues as far as psychologically that goes. I just wonder what your guys' opinion were on the state usurping the authority of parents when we don't agree with what the parents are doing.
I mean, this is always the case, really, isn't it? I guess I'll go first. I think it's very rarely the precedent of the state to ever usurp the rights of the parents. I mean, as to John talked, even in sort of more more rundown areas of the countries that we all live in, I think that ultimately the benefit of the child is being with the parents, whether we disagree with them or not. There's plenty of obese children in the street that I live in, even, and I disagree with what their parents feed them. But I don't think that we should be saying, well, actually, your child has McDonald's every day, or eats 20 cookies every day, so we need to intervene right now because this is arguably child neglect or child cruelty. So you've got this. I don't think it's ever this very rare, in extreme rare circumstances, has the state any right to intervene with a child unless that child is going to come to significant and immediate harm. But where do we, then we begs the question, where do you draw the line of harm? Because I consider it harm to have McDonald's every day, but the state won't. The state might consider it harm, though, if your child says they're a girl and they're actually a boy, and you're not going to pump them full of hormones. So well, as soon as you give an inch, you give a mile when it comes to these scenarios. And so I fully believe, okay, there might be some children that suffer under the neglect of some parents, but freedom or safety never outweighs freedom. John?
Yeah, and this is definitely an interesting case, and I am of the opinion that the Supreme Court ruling in this case, and I have not, I want to be very clear, I have not read the decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, but
neither have I.
Yeah, and I need to. But I do think, again, when we're making laws, the laws need to basically reflect they should never be based on extremes of what is and is not allowed. It should be like, hey, basically everybody agrees like this is or is not good, and I'm fairly libertarian, and I don't love the government making laws, but this is one instance where, because it's like the gender transitioning therapies and surgeries that seem to be irreversible, that a parent making that decision feels more like it's harming the child permanently, and does feel different than a child eating hamburgers from McDonald's for the first 18 years of their life. That is reversible. Is it harmful? Yes, but one's reversible, one is not. Right? At least according to what I've been reading. And it, it can prevent, if a child decides later to transition back, or detransition, I guess is the correct term, or whatever. If they decide to detransition, very often that child is sterile and unable to have children, which is a permanent thing. And so I think there is a point where, if we're creating permanent harm, that might be a role of the government. And it hurts me to say that as a libertarian.
I did the decision today, and this is the way mine works, which is always a positive. I immediately go to, that's what they're doing. They're usurping the rights of that parent and their chosen doctor to do what they think is best for that child. And the state's going to come in and say, no, you can't do that. I know what's best for the child.
I agree. And, there's exceptions to, I think, every rule, it seems, and this is one where, I maybe disagree with some of the more hardcore libertarians out there. But in this instance, I'm like, yeah, this should be something that should be prevented because of the permanent harm that can be done. And
Well, look,
as opposed to something like we said, hamburgers, or
yeah. And I completely agree, and that's just sort of extrapolating where the path goes. And I believe, in this sort of scenario, this is why I believe we have laws in place. I don't believe the parents should be allowed, people should be allowed to harm people, or people should be allowed to murder or inflict grievous bodily harm. And so that's why we have these blanket laws, right? That make these certain things illegal. And I fully believe, trying to transition children, certainly medically, should be illegal. And
if you were to
therefore,
look at it, the majority of parents aren't trying to do that either, right?
yes,
exactly.
And so, I've been on a GK Chesterton kick, and he has something in there that if basically the majority of people agree, like, yeah, that's bad. And when I say majority, I mean the vast majority. Like, we're talking like 70, 80, 90% of the people. Like that, at that point, like, maybe we do need a law to prevent permanent harm to somebody.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's where it comes down to ultimately, is I don't think the state should intervene in most cases of parental decisions. But if we take this out, remove this this scenario, if a child was being beaten blue by their parents every day, then the parents are breaking the law. They're ultimately breaking the law, and yes, the state is there to intervene when the law is broken. Obviously, and in this scenario, I would argue, this is incredibly abusive, and so the state should therefore intervene with a child that is about to come to immediate and irreversible harm. So, but I think they need to be very tight, and as John said, we can't be looking at these hyper individualized cases as sort of as the way we frame our laws going forward. It needs to be sort of, we need to take realistic pictures into consideration. I'm going to let Paul jump in because I'm sure he has a lot to say before I ramble on even more.
Thank you, gentlemen. Look, against my nature, I'll try to offer a concise response to this issue, Craig, and thank you for your contribution. I'm perhaps more on the libertarian spectrum than this panel is. Usurping the rights of parents, or indeed the individual, is a hill to die on, is it not? Maybe not the hill, but one of them. And sure, that has costs, and costs to the fabric of life. When we say we need a law to prevent harm, that sounds warm and fluffy, but the devil's in the details. Define harm. You said it before, Alec. Safety doesn't outweigh freedom. That's the reason why the United States of America exists currently. Safety and freedom are somewhat mutually exclusive. Life is inherently and necessarily unsafe. High security prisons are meant to be safe, right? You're just locked in a cell with 4 walls, but no one's clamoring to get in there. And despite that, there is still all sorts of violence that happens in there. It's an unachievable ideal that's cloaked in fluffy sounding wording. And I think there's a degree of false choice in this discussion as well. There seems to be, when parenting fails, then the state is the only alternative to swoop in. What about community? What about extended family? What about good friends? These are the safety nets that I think libertarians see as functioning, practical solutions when the immediate family system fails. Can we not all perhaps see a scenario where a grandparent may step in, having very much skin in the game with their grandchild? And I've seen this in my personal life, I'm sure we all possibly have, where sheepishly a grandparent may see parents going off the rails a little bit and offer them, out of a state of love, some corrective suggestions. And there can be layers to that as well. And these can quite effectively, these more immediate onion layers, rings of privately managing these problems, I think, are quite practical. So otherwise, we are dealing with the tyranny of definitions. Someone mentioned this term before. I think it was you, Alex, that the immediate and irreversible harm. The state is an instrument of immediate and irreversible harm. I'll give you an example from recent years in this country. During the COVID era, there were some freedom protesters who assembled in Melbourne at the Shrine of Remembrance, a revered military site of remembrance. And it was quite symbolic. They were protesting against the state's overreach. And they assembled at, I thought, quite an appropriate location around a tomb or a location that respected the sacrifice of previous generations to gift us our freedoms. And what did the state do? The state came in with riot police against arguably the world's most disarmed population. There were parents and there were children there. And they advanced on that public who were peacefully protesting and fired indiscriminately rubber bullets into the crowd. Is this the institution that we are gifting the cherished role of mediating problems in the family? I'd question that at a fundamental level. And I think, as I mentioned before, there are more practical, family-oriented and community-oriented checks and balances against things when they go wrong.
Very fair points, Paul. All very fair points. I think perhaps the hard truth most of society needs to come to terms with is that with freedom, there will always be casualty. But the alternative of safety over freedom, there will be far more casualties. And I fundamentally believe, the issues we have, every spaces we talk about, almost everything that I discuss on Twitter, and I'm sure it's the same for you, Paul, and you, John, there cannot be a legal solution to what is ultimately a communal, what I perceive to be a communal and spiritual problem. They cannot be solved with legal solutions. They have to be solved with spiritual and communal solutions. Now, that will take a long time, and there's no clean-cut way to do that. It's going to be messy and it's going to be gradual. But when we look to solve spiritual and communal problems with legal solutions, all we end up doing is creating more problems than we started with, or different problems than we started with. And so we never actually end up healing society because, and I fully support what you said, Paul, we should have communities, we should have churches, we should have extended family, wherein they are the checks and balances. But we exist within a society where those values, those communal values, are low on the agenda. They have been stamped out of much of society. Certainly in the UK, I think the UK in particular is a very pro-state country. It might exist more comprehensively in the States, where you guys have a more, there is a bit more of an independent nature, a bit more of an entrepreneurial side to your culture. And I see this reflected even in the homeschooling environment here in the UK, where there's a stark contrast between the drivers here in the UK than there is in the US, where the drivers in the US have freedom from the state and are also faith-based, and the homeschooling drivers here in the UK are largely not faith-based, because we're not largely a faith-based population. And many of the homeschooling communities I've been a part of, or I've experienced, have been very pro-state, have been very, we want all the help we can get off you, Mr. Government. And so, because that's the nature of our culture, that's the nature of having a more socialist culture here in the UK, with a socialist healthcare system and other socialist tendencies. And so there really is this case of, I think we need to, understand with freedom will always come casualty, but with safety comes a lot more casualties. And so we have to be willing to accept cases like you've just brought up, Craig, that, okay, well, maybe these parents will try to transition their kid. What right do I have, to intervene in that? What are the costs? And I've said this before when we were talking about AI, every decision we make, what are the costs? Let's reflect on the overall costs of those, because what we may have just done is given the state precedent to intervene in a lot more than they've currently intervened in. And what, as I said, and as Paul, you extrapolated on, we're playing a losing game of definitions then, aren't we? What is harm? What constitutes harm? John.
Yeah, I have to run, my friends. So I just wanted to just quickly kind of end. I 100% support parents, but there are very, very rare instances when people are creating more harm by being the parent. Like, at the end of the day, like that exists. We do need to look at that, but that's very rare. I will also say that, I do think that our current school laws, our current compulsory education laws, call people who are taking their kids on vacation harm. That's not harm in my mind. I think we've gone too far when we talk about it that way. So I as I said, I apologize. I have to run. This day ended up being very busy for me, but this conversation has been amazing. And I'm going to end with the quote that I started with, Horace Mann, who is the father of the American public education system. We who are engaged in the sacred cause of education are entitled to look upon all parents as having given hostages to our cause. I reject that statement. I don't think that's something that we should be considering our children as hostages to any cause other than the parents' cause. So thank you, guys. I gotta go.
Thanks, John. As always. See you next time. There we go. I think it's a good time to close it overall anyway. It's getting relatively late here in the UK. But my closing remarks, and then I'll invite you, John, and even yourself, Greg, if you want to add some closing remarks, feel free to jump in when the space is available. But as I said, I think we need to come to terms with two hard truths here. Freedom will always trump safety, and with freedom will always come casualty. There will always be casualties. I know there's these rare circumstances, as John said, where parents are terrible parents, they're harmful parents. But will we ever stamp that out by giving more rights to the state? There will always be a small percentage of terrible parents. And the second is, ultimately, we cannot solve communal and spiritual problems with legal solutions. It's just not a viable path forward. Paul.
Thank you, Alec. I think that's a great summary. And I also agree with John. Harm does exist. It cannot be eliminated from life. Freedom is messy. And we need to resist the temptation to say, just give me the gun this time, and I'll draw the line right where I think it needs to be. And I'm reminded of the Ben Franklin quote, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty.
Oh, Paul, we actually lost you at the last couple of words of that quote, but it was a very powerful quote. Craig, is there anything you wanted to add? Did you want to add some closing remarks? You don't have to. There's no obligation. Just giving you the floor.
Yeah, just enjoy the conversation. But I do think the line, like you guys have said, the line we draw, we have to draw somewhere. Because, well, the Supreme Court drew it this morning saying, the hormonal therapy that the parents have chosen for their child, the state is going to not allow that. So there is, I hear the phrase trust parents. As a former public school teacher, I think it's more trust some parents, because I've seen it. I've seen it. There's a lot of them that shouldn't be trusted. And I always use the fact in our country, we have more kids living without their father in the home than with. So parents need to step up their game. I mean, that should not happen.
Absolutely. I think you just exemplified two very big talking points here, is that ultimately, again, it's a communal and spiritual problem that will solve the fatherhood problem. But secondly, myself, Paul, John, and yourself have all decided to draw the line in different places. And so we've just shown the problem to to the world. How is everyone else going to draw the line? Thank you all for listening so much. It's been wonderful. Paul, John, and myself will be back again soon, either next week or the week after. But we do these very regularly on a Wednesday. On a Wednesday, I was going to say evening because it's evening for me, but it's very early for Paul, and it's midday-ish for John. So we do it on a Wednesday. Thank you all for listening.